Ukraine's President Zelenskyy says peace talks with US negotiators have been productive but not easy. He was speaking following talks in Berlin aimed at reaching a peace deal to end the war in Ukraine. Zelenskyy said he wants clear security guarantees for his country from the US and Europe before he will consider making territorial concessions to Russia. He has been under heavy pressure from the Trump administration to cede territory to Russia in exchange for peace.
The mood appeared cordial and cautiously optimistic on Monday night. European leaders gathered for talks with President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and US Special Envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner in an effort to find a way to end Russia's war in Ukraine. And back at the White House, US President Donald Trump appeared hopeful too, after some positive feedback from the meeting in Germany.
And I think we're closer now, and they will tell you that they're closer now. We had numerous conversations with President Putin of Russia, and I think we're closer now than we have been ever, and we'll see what we can do.
The most important talks with Trump's team in Berlin took place almost entirely behind closed doors. The president of Ukraine said afterwards that the meeting was not easy, but productive. Witkoff indicated that they made a lot of progress, but did not elaborate any further. A US official said Washington is putting pressure on Ukraine to leave its eastern Donetsk region for Russia. President Zelenskyy reiterated he cannot agree to permanently give up territories in eastern Ukraine, as it would cause a ferocious backlash at home. But in a major concession, he said Ukraine would forego NATO membership, tentatively accepting unspecified assurances from the US instead.
We have heard from the US that there will be security guarantees that are similar to NATO's collective defense pledge, Article 5, and that is a first step. Then the question of monitoring a ceasefire. I would say this is the very foundation of security guarantees.
Meanwhile, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz appealed to the Russian leadership to stop attacking Ukraine and to accept the peace plan collectively drafted by Washington, Brussels and Kyiv.
Perhaps the Russian leadership still has a shred of human decency left and will at least leave the population in peace for a few days over Christmas. And perhaps that could then be the beginning of reasonable constructive talks on how we can achieve lasting peace in Ukraine.
After the Berlin talks, the German government is looking to US negotiators to convince Russia's leader Vladimir Putin to accept the peace plan. A US official in Berlin said some 90% of the issues between Russia and Ukraine have now been resolved, but a date for the next meeting with the Russians has not yet been set.
And for reactions, let's cross to DW correspondent Nick Connolly in Kyiv and correspondent Sergei Satanovskii, who joins us from Riga. Nick, let's go to you first. Zelenskyy has said that territory concessions are not an option in these negotiations, but that Ukraine could give up its NATO membership ambitions. Is Ukraine in a strong enough position to maintain its borders?
Look, I think right now Ukraine is doing everything to show that it's willing to engage with the Trump team. It doesn't want to be blamed for when these talks fall over, and that is the expectation here in Ukraine, because they don't see any willingness from the Russians to really seriously engage. But on the territory, on the question of leaving the bits of eastern Ukraine that Ukraine still controls, I think that is realistically a red line, not only in terms of military strategy, because there are built-up areas in places like Kramatorsk which are a lot easier to defend than open countryside. So if they give that up without a shot being fired, the next attack from the Russian side is going to be a whole lot easier. We've seen how difficult it's been for the Russians to try and take Pokrovsk. It's taken over a year now and they still haven't got it fully. Then there is the aspect of the precedent. Will it basically allow Russia to pressure Ukraine to giving up more bits of territory, rewarding that kind of approach? And then there's a question of public opinion. If those soldiers were then to return from the front lines, having spent years losing lives and risking their lives to hold on to that territory, and then it's just given away, that's basically going to create an internal political crisis here. Zelenskyy might lose his job, and that is exactly the kind of instability that the Russians are trying to create. That is the Ukrainian perspective.
Now, no Ukrainian land for Putin. Would Russia accept that, Sergei?
Well, the Kremlin was watching the talks in Berlin, but commenting on them rather cautiously. In Moscow, for example, there has so far been no reaction to what was said about territorial concessions, and previously Russia, of course, insisted on maximalist demands, including the withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from the entire Donbass region. Putin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, said yesterday, only in very broad terms, that Ukraine's possible NATO membership remains a cornerstone issue and stands apart from all other questions. At the same time, Peskov said that the Kremlin expects the White House to brief it later on the outcome of the Berlin discussions. That said, a more candid view, or what seems a more candid view from Moscow, is now being carried by the state news agency TASS, and it published a statement by one of the Kremlin's mouthpieces that the talks in Berlin basically failed to take Russia's position and the situation on the battlefield into account, and that as a result the plans being discussed are far from realistic.
Nick, how are people in Ukraine reacting to this meeting?
Look, I think there is a perception that this is more serious than previous rounds. There is more at stake. All those leaders all together in Berlin yesterday. I think people very clearly kind of registered also the optics. You had Merz there basically at Zelensky's side, talking to the Americans, not just as a host, but basically representing the European position at the side of the Ukrainians, making clear that that basically is indivisible, that Europe with Ukraine is negotiating basically as a whole to try and prevent some kind of deal on Russia's terms. I think there was also a lot of comment about the fact that it's basically the first time that Witkoff and Kushner are really talking to Zelensky. They haven't turned up here in Kiev yet. They're, very often we've seen Witkoff go to Moscow, but no interest seemingly from that side to come to Kiev. So the fact that that now has happened, we even had in the press conference Zelensky saying, well, maybe we would have made more progress faster if they'd actually talked to me directly. So there is a sense that maybe now they are engaging with the Ukrainians and listening a bit more to the Ukrainian position rather than just going to Moscow, picking up kind of talking points and then kind of sending them to Europe and Ukraine.
Sergei, during all these peace efforts and talks, Russia keeps relentlessly attacking Ukraine. Does that mean that Putin is not taking these talks too seriously, as we've seen in previous negotiation attempts?
I would say that inside the Kremlin, the view is that the war and the negotiations should run in parallel. Putin has always opposed any pause in the fighting while peace talks are underway, despite repeated calls, of course, from Ukraine, from President Trump, from European leaders as well. The Kremlin believes that dominance on the battlefield can strengthen Russia's negotiating position, and from Moscow's perspective, time on its side is on its side. And in the long run, it expects to win this war of attrition. And in that sense, Putin is trying to force his maximalist demands not only on politicians in Europe, in the US, in Ukraine, but also on ordinary Ukrainians as well. And I guess only these could explain Russian strikes on civilian targets across the whole country, across Ukraine.
DW correspondents Nick Connolly and Sergei Satanovskii, thank you both very much. Now, for more on the Berlin talks, I'm now joined by DW's NATO and EU correspondent Teri Schultz. Teri, what's the view from there in Brussels on the apparent give and take in these talks, in which the Russians, of course, are not participating?
Well, I think there are good reasons for more optimism coming out of the European side. It's the first time that we've seen them actually literally have these coveted seats at the table with this team of Trump negotiators. And there seems to be, from all the public statements that we've seen, an actual taking into account of Ukrainian and European concerns, more than we've seen in the past. Of course, I've just been watching some EU leaders of the eastern flank countries arrive in Helsinki this morning, and while all of them are very welcoming of the efforts, they point out that in Moscow there's been no sign that President Putin is interested in a peace deal, and so all of this may come to naught.
Now, when security guarantees are discussed to prevent Russia from another invasion, a future invasion, what might a European peacekeeping force look like?
Yeah, this is something that does seem to be taking shape in these negotiations more than we've seen in the past. It's, of course, been discussed for a long time in these coalition of the willing meetings that the Europeans have been having. But what the Europeans now say in black and white in a statement after yesterday's meeting is that they will be willing to help secure Ukraine's seas, to secure Ukraine's skies, that Ukraine should be allowed to keep, and this is an issue with Moscow, a standing force of 800,000 soldiers. That's something that Moscow doesn't want to see at all. And that the Europeans would then help regenerate the Ukrainian military with training, with equipment, and key, that the U.S. would provide an early warning system of ceasefire violations. Now, all of this sounds great until you again go back to the fact that Moscow doesn't seem willing to accept any of these conditions. There are big questions remaining about this force as well. Would there be boots on the ground inside Ukraine? That's something we've been discussing hypothetically for a long time, and that does not seem to be answered in these latest negotiations.
Now, Teri, we heard there in our report Zelenskyy saying the U.S. is offering security guarantees similar to NATO's defense pledge, Article 5. How far would that pledge go, and is the U.S. still considered a trustworthy ally in that matter?
Big questions there, Gerhardt, and I'm not sure we have the answers to them because I have not seen clarified what the U.S. means by Article 5 like guarantees. All I know is what Article 5 itself does mean, and that would mean that if Ukraine were to be attacked again, that its partners and allies would come to its defense physically. I don't know that all European countries and the United States are prepared to rush into Ukraine if Russia violates potential ceasefire. Another question is, would there be a nuclear deterrent, the U.S. nuclear deterrent that is the ultimate backstop for NATO allies in Article 5? Would that be included for Ukraine? We certainly have not seen answers to these questions publicly, and I don't know if they're getting them privately either. And yeah, those are what Ukraine would need to feel secure.
DW's Teri Schultz there for us, reporting from Brussels. Thank you, Teri.